The evening invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, printed on cardstock that felt expensive in her hands. Madison Chen worked as a data analyst at Harrison & Associates, a position that had never once required her attendance at corporate networking events. Yet here she was, reading instructions about appropriate attire and parking arrangements for something called a client appreciation reception. The email bore the signature of her department head, someone she had seen exactly twice in the past year, suggesting this particular event demanded representation across all levels of the firm. She had spent the better part of Wednesday contemplating excuses, rolling through various scenarios that might justify her absence. A migraine seemed plausible but dishonest. A family obligation felt safer, though she had no family to speak of beyond an aunt who lived 3 hours north and called every other Sunday with questions about her well-being that Madison could never quite answer properly. By Thursday afternoon, she had reconciled herself to attendance as inevitable, the kind of professional obligation that refusal would signal something wrong, something worth noticing, and she had spent 8 years perfecting the art of not being noticed at all. The hotel ballroom occupied the entire 42nd floor of a downtown tower, all floor-to-ceiling glass and carefully positioned orchids in vases that probably cost more than her car payment. She arrived at 8:17, deliberately late enough that most initial greetings had concluded, deliberately early enough that departure before 10 would appear appropriate. Her dress was charcoal gray, selected specifically for its ability to recede into background, and her shoes were practical in a way that suggested someone who might leave early due to discomfort. She had worn her dark hair down, nothing pinned or styled, just the way it fell across her shoulders in a manner that drew no particular attention. The bartender made her a vodka and soda without her specifying the brand, and she held the glass throughout the evening like it represented purpose, like standing near a column with a drink in her hand meant she was engaged in something other than simple survival through hours that felt deliberately constructed to feel interminable. She listened to conversations about market projections and client acquisitions, nodding at appropriate intervals when someone made direct eye contact, but mostly she occupied space without occupying it, present but somehow still absent, a skill she had perfected over the past 8 years, until it felt like her actual superpower. At 10:43, she decided she had completed the minimum requirements of attendance. The evening had proven unremarkable in the way she had anticipated. No one had asked personal questions. No one had attempted to draw her into conversations about ambitions or career trajectories or what she enjoyed doing outside of work. She had been left alone, which was precisely what she wanted, which was what she always wanted. And yet, standing in the elevator descending through the building, she felt the weight of that solitude in a way that made her chest tight. The parking garage occupied 3 subterranean levels, climate-controlled and harshly lit with fluorescent strips that turned everyone who walked beneath them into versions of themselves that looked faintly ill. She had parked in the section farthest from the elevator because she preferred not to circle around occupied spaces, preferred not to engage in the small dance of parking lot negotiation that some people seem to enjoy. The concrete stretched in front of her in that particular way that underground spaces did, seeming to extend further than should be physically possible, and her car sat in approximately the 3rd lot, like a familiar landmark in otherwise unremarkable terrain. She was somewhere between the elevator bank and the midpoint of the garage, still moving with the kind of forward momentum that didn't yet suggest destination, when the 2 men emerged from the darkness between her car and the concrete support structure that separated this section from the next. She understood almost immediately that this was not random. The way they moved, with coordination and purpose, suggested planning rather than coincidence, and the oldest part of her nervous system, the part that had been vigilant for 8 years, suddenly activated in a way that felt like being struck by electricity. The first man grabbed her left arm, and the second positioned himself to prevent any horizontal movement toward the parking attendant station she had noticed when she first descended into this level. She had approximately 2 seconds to process what was happening before she understood that the conversation everyone conducted about trusting your instincts meant nothing when your instincts did not translate into effective action. She tried to pull away, which was futile, and she tried to run, which was rendered impossible by the hand around her arm, and she tried to call for help, which produced a sound that seemed to absorb into the concrete rather than carry toward anything human. The second man said something about cooperation, about not making this complicated, about how much simpler everything would be if she simply remained calm and complied with instructions that he would provide momentarily. His voice held the practiced quality of someone who had delivered this particular speech multiple times, with varying results, none of which seemed to have improved his delivery. The first man, still holding her arm, dragged her toward the space between vehicles where the shadows gathered most densely, and she felt the barrier between rational thought and complete panic beginning to thin, in a way that felt like drowning, but while standing on solid ground. Then there was sound, sudden and definitive, like something large and heavy moving through space. At velocity it should not have achieved. The grip on her arm released, and both men suddenly repositioned themselves away from her. Their earlier coordination replaced by something that resembled confusion, followed quickly by an attempt at violence that was interrupted before it fully manifested. A third figure had emerged from the darkness. Someone so tall he had to adjust his trajectory to avoid collision with the concrete beam. And the two men who had been advancing toward her retreated with the kind of speed that suggested they had evaluated the situation and determined that whatever their original assignment had been, it was no longer worth the physical consequences of persistence. The new arrival was tall and broad-shouldered in a way that spoke to disciplined training or possibly inherited physiology, though his face suggested the former more than the latter. He wore a tailored suit, despite the underground parking environment, a choice that seemed deliberately impractical for most situations, but entirely intentional for this one. His hair was dark, his eyes were the kind of brown that seemed to absorb the fluorescent light rather than reflect it, and his face held no visible scarring or injury, just clean lines and structures that could have belonged to someone successful in legitimate enterprises, had his posture not communicated violence with every subtle adjustment he made to his stance. He looked at her with an expression that could not be categorized as concern in the traditional sense, more like assessment, the way someone examined an item to determine its utility. He said, "You should move away from this location. Your car is approximately 50 yards northeast of this current position. I would recommend entering it and leaving the premises." She had not moved. She was processing the remarkable fact that the two men who had held her just moments earlier had disappeared into the darkness of the garage like they had never existed at all, leaving behind only the sound of car doors closing at some distant location. She was processing the equally remarkable fact that the stranger had intervened without being asked, had removed a threat with what appeared to be minimal effort, and was now suggesting she depart as though his involvement was tangential rather than transformative. She managed, "Who are you?" The stranger did not answer the question. Instead, he said, "Those individuals did not select your location at random. Their intent was not robbery in the traditional sense, and their knowledge of your schedule suggests either surveillance or information purchased from someone with legitimate access to hotel operations. Either way, their return in a matter of hours with reinforcement is functionally guaranteed. You can proceed to your vehicle and drive home, and they will be waiting in either your residential building or potentially your place of employment. You can contact law enforcement, and there will be extensive questioning about your involvement in whatever this represents, though you appear to have no involvement beyond being in a convenient location at a convenient time. Or you can come with me, and I can ensure that you survive the next week without significant incident." She should have been terrified. She recognized in some abstract way that she should have refused, should have thanked him, and driven to the nearest police precinct, should have done something resembling what a rational person would have done in response to these circumstances. Instead, she said, "Where?" His expression did not shift. If anything, a minute amount of tension released from the muscles around his jaw, as though she had confirmed something he had been calculating. He said, "My vehicle is 3 sections from here. We need to move now. Stay close to me and do not deviate from my trajectory, regardless of what you perceive or how your body responds to the transition." She followed him through the parking garage in the way someone might follow instructions during a fire drill, with the kind of obedience that came from the recognition that alternatives were not actually available. His car was a sedan in a shade of gray so muted it seemed designed for invisibility, parked in a location that suggested he had chosen it for its proximity to emergency exits and distance from main traffic patterns. He opened the passenger door, and she entered, and the world beyond that car door seemed to lose coherence almost immediately after the doors closed and locked with an authoritative sound of security mechanisms engaging. The drive through the city revealed very little about their actual destination. He navigated through streets in a manner that seemed deliberately circuitous, doubling back through neighborhoods, using residential roads where highways would have been more efficient, and she understood that he was checking for surveillance or pursuit, that he was making calculations about threat assessment that she could not quite follow, but could certainly recognize. The car smelled like leather and something else. Cologne, or possibly just the ambient scent of wealth. And there was in that scent something that made her body register danger, even as his presence had technically neutralized the threat she had been facing. Finally, after what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 40 minutes, they arrived at a building on the North Shore. Exactly the kind of structure that represented spaces where security was not merely professional courtesy, but architectural imperative. He pulled into an underground garage, this one enclosed and monitored by multiple cameras, and he used a keycard that was presumably his own to access the elevator system. He pressed the button for the penthouse level, and the elevator ascended through 42 floors of building, while she stood beside him in the kind of silence that felt pregnant with unspoken complexity. When the doors opened, they revealed an apartment that was precisely the kind of space she would have expected someone like him to inhabit. Furniture that suggested both expense and restraint. Art on the walls that was carefully selected rather than merely purchased. Windows that overlooked the city in a manner that suggested he spent his evenings observing the world below, from a position of elevation and distance. He gestured toward a bedroom visible through an open doorway and said, "You'll find this space adequate. There are clothes in the closet that should approximate your size. You should rest. I'll explain what's necessary to explain in the morning," she said. "What's your name?" He was already moving toward a hallway that presumably led to other rooms, perhaps his own private space, and he paused without turning around. He said, "Victor Castellano. And before you ask, yes, I know who you are. I knew your father. That knowledge is precisely why you're here instead of remaining in that parking garage. We'll discuss what that means tomorrow." He disappeared into the hallway, leaving her alone in the penthouse with the city lights spread below her like a map of a world that had fundamentally altered its shape during the drive from the hotel to this location. Madison stood in that apartment for a long time, processing the remarkable fact that the man who had saved her, the man who had just introduced himself as Victor Castellano, was simultaneously the name she had been learning to associate with her father's death since she was 18 years old. She was standing in the apartment of the man she had always believed responsible for ending her father's life, and she was alive, and he had saved her, and none of that made any coherent sense. Consciousness returned through layers, the way it did when medication had been involved in the process of waking. Madison's eyelids felt weighted, her entire body submerged in a heaviness that suggested either profound sedation or significant trauma, possibly both working in tandem. A cool sensation against her lips registered first, water or something approximating it, and a voice from somewhere near a window instructed her not to move too suddenly, because movement would damage the sutures that had been placed during her recovery period. She forced her eyes open against the pressure that seemed to hold them shut. The room materialized slowly, expensive furnishings taking shape as visual coherence returned. Not a hospital. The ceiling was coffered wood, not acoustic tile. The windows overlooked grounds that were maintained with the kind of obsessive precision typical of properties where security was not merely a feature, but an architectural principle. She was lying in a bed that probably represented a month of her salary, dressed in clothing that was not hers, with an intravenous line in her arm delivering fluids she had not consented to receive. "Where am I?" she managed. Her voice cracked from disuse or sedation or both. The woman who had been sitting near the window did not immediately respond. She was older, perhaps 60, with dark hair streaked with silver pulled back in a style that suggested European sensibilities. Her expression offered nothing, revealed nothing. The kind of neutrality that came from professional practice in environments where emotions were considered liabilities. "You're safe," she finally said. "That's what matters." It was not an answer. Madison attempted to sit up and immediately regretted the decision. Pain in her shoulder radiated downward in distinct waves, a living thing with its own rhythm and intensity. Her ribs protested equally against the movement. She fell back against the pillows, breathing carefully through her nose, trying to reconstruct what had happened between the moment of waking in Victor's apartment and this present location. "How long?" she managed. 4 weeks, another voice answered. Victor stood in the doorway, and in full daylight, he was somehow worse than he had been in the darkness of the parking garage or the dim interior of his car. The structured perfection of his features seemed almost cruel in its symmetry. His eyes held that quality of absorbing light rather than reflecting it, dark brown and catalog everything they registered. He wore a shirt with sleeves rolled up, and his forearms suggested regular violence of some kind, muscle development that came from discipline or possibly from practical experience with physical confrontation. "You coded twice," Victor continued, moving further into the room. "My physician wasn't certain you'd make it. Your injuries were more severe than initially apparent." She tried to speak, but her throat felt constructed from sandpaper. She pointed weakly at her lips, and the older woman brought water, helping her drink from a glass with the careful attention of someone who had performed this exact action multiple times in multiple situations. The water was cool and tasted faintly of minerals, and it helped stabilize the dizziness that had been threatening to pull her under again. "Your name is Dr. Elena Moretti," Victor said, gesturing toward the older woman. "She has been your primary care provider for the duration of your recovery. She is exceptionally skilled at her work, and more importantly, she is completely discreet." Madison understood that discreet meant, in this context, that Dr. Moretti would not be reporting anything to any official channels, that she had entered into some arrangement that involved her continued employment and presumably her safety in exchange for her silence. She understood also that she had been shot, that she had survived something that most people in her circumstance would not have survived, and that the reason for her continued existence sat somewhere in the intersection of Victor's intervention and whatever relationship existed between him and the woman now leaving the room with a quiet that suggested practice in disappearing. "What happened?" Madison asked, though she was fairly certain she already understood the fundamentals. Victor pulled a chair closer to the bed, an antique piece that looked expensive, and probably was. He sat with the kind of posture that suggested someone trained in violence, spine straight, shoulders relaxed, positioned where he could observe both her and the doorway simultaneously. The 2 men in the parking garage were not operating independently. They were operatives sent by someone with the financial resources to identify you, locate you, and attempt to neutralize you in a public location where your disappearance would create specific consequences. "Consequences for whom?" she asked. "For me," Victor said. "You were in the wrong location at the wrong time because you were in my geographic territory. They were attempting to establish that my security protocols were fallible, that I could not protect assets within my own jurisdiction, that therefore my operational stability was compromised. You were not targeted because of who you are. You were targeted because of your proximity to me." Madison understood that this was meant to be comforting, that he was explaining her near-death experience as essentially accidental, but the comfort failed to materialize. She had been shot because she was near him. She was recovering in his apartment because he felt responsible for her presence in that parking garage. She was alive because he had decided her continued existence was worth the effort of medical intervention and recovery oversight. "My father," she said. "You knew him." Victor did not respond immediately. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds below, which were maintained with obsessive precision, every tree trimmed to exact specifications, every flower bed arranged with geometric accuracy. When he finally spoke, his voice held something that might have been genuine remorse, though she recognized that criminals likely developed facility with fabricating emotions when situations required it. "Your father was a financial consultant," Victor said. "He was hired by someone within my organization to conduct an audit of various accounting practices. What he discovered were discrepancies in multiple ledgers, systematic irregularities that suggested either incompetence or intentional manipulation. He brought these findings to someone he believed was in a position to address them. That person was actually operating for a rival organization, someone whose goal was to create institutional doubt about my leadership and competence. Your father's death was arranged by that rival as part of a larger campaign against my interests. It was pragmatic for them, regrettable for you, and unfortunately necessary from their perspective. You killed my father." Madison said, though her voice carried uncertainty now, because Victor's explanation complicated what she had believed with absolute certainty for 8 years. No, Victor said. I did not. The man who ordered your father's death was named Antonio Giordano. He was based in Chicago. He used your father's death as one piece in a larger strategy to destabilize my operations. I was not in a position to prevent it at that time. I was not aware of what was about to happen until after it had already occurred. By the time I understood the situation fully, your father was already dead, and retaliation against Giordano would have drawn attention that neither of us needed. Madison processed this information slowly, understanding that the narrative she had constructed 8 years ago, the story that had defined her entire adult existence, had been incomplete at best and fundamentally incorrect at worst. The man she had feared, the criminal whose name she had learned to associate with her father's death, had not actually killed her father, though he had the resources and presumably the motivation to do so if he had chosen. Instead, a different criminal, a different rival, a different perspective on the world had taken her father's life. So why am I here? She asked. Victor turned from the window. Because those 2 men in the parking garage were, as it turns out, connected to the same organization that killed your father. That organization is in the process of destabilizing again. The man who has been operating against my interests for the past 8 years is dying. When he dies, what remains of his organization will either consolidate under someone else's command or will fragment into smaller pieces that will war with each other for territorial advantage. Until that situation clarifies, anyone in proximity to me is potentially valuable as leverage or as a message. You are vulnerable. You are here because I can guarantee your security within this location in ways that I cannot guarantee anywhere else. Over the following weeks, Madison began to understand the rhythms of captivity disguised as protection. Rosa, the woman who visited daily to tend to her wounds and manage her medications, brought meals on trays and performed medical tasks with clinical precision. She was older, European, spoke very little beyond functional necessities, and there was in her professionalism a certain compassion that Madison recognized as performative, but that she appreciated nonetheless, because the performance at least acknowledged that she was a human being deserving of dignified treatment. Victor appeared at irregular intervals, always when she was least expecting him. He would stand in the doorway of her room, sometimes for minutes without speaking, simply observing her reading or staring out the window, or attempting physical therapy exercises to rebuild mobility in her shoulder. Eventually, he began sitting with her, bringing books that he recommended, discussing passages that he found particularly meaningful or historically significant. She learned that he was well-read, that his education had extended far beyond practical training in criminal enterprise, that he possessed a sophisticated understanding of history and art and music that suggested either formal education or self-directed learning pursued with impressive discipline. "What is your background?" she asked one afternoon when he had been sitting with her for nearly an hour, discussing a novel she had finished the previous evening. "How does someone like you become this?" He did not answer immediately. He was looking at the book in her lap, but his gaze seemed focused on something distant, something beyond the physical pages. "I was born into this world," he finally said. "My family operated in Europe for generations. By the time I was old enough to understand what that meant, I was already too entangled to leave. I was educated in schools that my family selected, trained in disciplines that my family deemed necessary, introduced to business practices that operated according to rules I did not write, but that I learned to follow meticulously because failure in this world results in permanent consequences. So you had no choice," Madison said. "I had many choices," Victor corrected. "But all of those choices occurred within the context of a life that was already determined. I could choose how to operate within the structure, but I could not choose the structure itself. You, on the other hand, chose to be a data analyst. You chose your education, your career, your residence, your entire approach to existence. You had the freedom to construct yourself according to your own specifications. And then you nearly died because of proximity to me, which I recognize is a form of cosmic injustice that I cannot undo." By the end of the 2nd month, Madison could walk the perimeter of the penthouse without using walls for support. By the end of the 4th month, She could almost forget that bullets had pierced her body at all. The pain had diminished to occasional twinges when she reached in certain directions, and her shoulder had regained a functional range of motion that Rosa declared satisfactory, according to whatever medical standards governed her professional practice. During that period, Victor gradually revealed more about his operation, not out of any sense of obligation, but because she was present, because she was observing the world he inhabited, and because attempting to maintain operational security around someone who was living in his penthouse while recovering from injuries sustained due to his affairs seemed counterproductive. She learned that he employed analysts and forensic accountants and specialists in cybersecurity, people with degrees from institutions like MIT and Stanford, individuals whose skills would have been valuable in legitimate enterprises but who for various reasons had chosen to apply their expertise within his organization. She also learned that Victor operated according to a code that was, if not admirable, at least consistent. She overheard him refuse a proposal that would have involved trafficking. The conversation occurred in his study, and his response to the suggestion was a single word delivered with absolute finality: no. Another discussion involved an operation that would have resulted in civilian casualties, and his response was immediate and decisive: find another approach. He was a criminal, yes, but he was a criminal with limitations, with rules that he had established, and that he enforced upon his organization with the same precision he applied to every other aspect of his operations. By the 3rd month, he began allowing her to write letters to her aunt, the only family she had left beyond her now-deceased father. The letters were screened by someone in Victor's organization, read for security purposes, and sent through intermediaries that made them impossible to trace. Her aunt's responses came back through the same channels, printed out, and delivered to Madison by Rosa without commentary or explanation. Her aunt's first letter had been desperate, filled with questions about where Madison was, and what had happened, and whether she was being held against her will. Madison's responses had been carefully worded to provide reassurance without explanation, to confirm that she was alive and safe without revealing anything that could be tracked or traced, or used as leverage against her aunt. Victor appeared in the doorway of her room one evening and asked if she was happy, which seemed like an absurd question to pose to someone who was, by definition, imprisoned in a luxury apartment while recovering from gunshot wounds. "Am I supposed to be happy?" she asked, though she understood what he was really asking, which was whether she had adapted to her circumstances, whether the forced proximity was becoming acceptable rather than merely tolerable. "No," he said, "but I wanted to know if you were becoming less miserable. There's a difference. Misery is a choice. You've stopped making that choice somewhere in the past month. I wanted to confirm that I wasn't misinterpreting the shift." She did not contradict him because he was right. Somewhere during the weeks of recovery and conversation and gradual integration into his world, she had stopped resenting her captivity with the same intensity that had characterized her initial days in the penthouse. She still understood that she was imprisoned, that her freedom existed only at Victor's discretion, but she was beginning to comprehend that within the confines of that imprisonment, there were possibilities for connection that she had never experienced in her previous life. "Why are you keeping me here?" she asked. "You could have arranged for my safety without bringing me to your apartment. You could have hired protection, relocated me, done any number of things that would have accomplished security without this level of personal involvement." Victor was quiet for a long moment. He stood at the window, looking out at the grounds that remained perfectly manicured regardless of season, and when he finally spoke, his voice held something she could not quite categorize. "Because I could not bear the thought of you being anywhere else," he said. "And that is precisely why I will eventually let you go, because you deserve the freedom to make that choice, and I cannot be the person who denies it to you." The months dissolved into a pattern that resembled ordinary existence more completely with each passing week. 6 months had elapsed since the night in the parking garage, and Madison had begun to recognize the rhythms of the penthouse with the kind of familiarity that suggested permanence rather than temporary captivity. Victor appeared most evenings around 6, sometimes carrying documents or items requiring his attention, sometimes simply entering the study where she had begun spending her afternoons reading, or working on the laptop he had provided with specific access limitations built into its architecture. The constraint of her situation had transformed into something more nuanced than simple imprisonment. She could move freely throughout the penthouse, could access the library he maintained with its collection of rare editions and contemporary works, could exercise in the private gym that occupied one wing of the space. She could not leave, and that fundamental restriction remained constant. But within that restriction, her world had developed texture and complexity that her previous life had entirely lacked. One evening in the 3rd month of her residence, Victor appeared with a book he had acquired specifically for her, a first edition of something she had mentioned wanting to read years prior to their first encounter in the parking garage. She did not ask how he had located something so specific or what he had paid to obtain it. She simply opened the pages and felt the weight of his attention in the gesture, understood that he had been listening to her more thoroughly than she had realized, that the knowledge was not incidental, but deliberately cultivated. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt inadequate to the actual significance of what he had done. Victor was already moving toward the window, his standard position when he wanted to speak, without maintaining direct eye contact. "You mentioned wanting to read it during a conversation we had approximately 3 months ago. I had assumed you would eventually acquire it yourself. But when I discovered a copy was available at auction, I decided the transaction was justified." She understood what he was really saying, which was that he had been paying attention during casual conversations, had been cataloging her preferences and desires, had been constructing knowledge of her that went far beyond what courtesy required. She understood also that this was dangerous, that allowing him to know her in this manner was allowing him to hold leverage over her emotional state that extended beyond his physical control of her circumstances. That night, she made the mistake of acknowledging her attraction to him. They were discussing a novel, a conversation that had begun over dinner and had continued into the study where Victor maintained various documents requiring his review. She was sitting on the sofa while he occupied a leather chair, positioned at an angle that allowed him to observe her without appearing to focus directly upon her. She made a comment about the protagonist's inability to maintain emotional distance from someone dangerous, and she watched his expression shift incrementally, understanding that he recognized the parallel she was drawing. "You're confusing proximity with connection," Victor said, his voice maintaining its characteristic evenness. "You're recovering in my home from injuries sustained due to my affairs. You're dependent upon me for security, for medical care, for everything that constitutes your current existence. What you're experiencing is not attraction. It's a psychological response to captivity that feels like choice, because I'm not actively constraining your movement." "You're wrong," Madison replied, and hearing herself contradict him seemed to surprise them both. "I understand the psychology of captivity. I understand Stockholm Syndrome and trauma bonding and every other framework that could be applied to this situation. I also understand that none of those frameworks change what I actually feel. I'm not confused about who you are or what you do. I'm simply acknowledging that despite those things, or possibly because of those things, I'm attracted to you." Victor stood abruptly and walked to the window, the kind of gesture that suggested her statement had disrupted something in his carefully maintained equilibrium. "I cannot act on that attraction," he said, his voice lower than usual. "To do so would constitute taking advantage of a situation where you are fundamentally vulnerable. Regardless of what you believe you feel, you are not in a position to consent meaningfully to anything beyond what already exists between us." Over the following weeks, the dynamic between them became progressively more charged. Victor maintained his professional distance, continued the careful avoidance of any physical contact beyond what courtesy required, but his attention to her became more obvious and less carefully disguised. He would stand closer than necessary when they discussed books or current events. He would remain in her presence longer than his schedule presumably demanded. Once, when she reached for a book on a high shelf, he moved to assist, and then seemed to reconsider, stopping himself before his hand made contact with hers, as though touching her would trigger consequences he was not prepared to manage. Her birthday arrived on a Tuesday in the 5th month of her residence. She had not mentioned the date to anyone, had not anticipated that Victor would have any knowledge of its significance. Yet when she entered her bedroom that evening, a present sat on the bed, wrapped in paper that suggested someone with actual taste had selected the presentation, rather than simply purchasing something from a store. Inside was a first edition of a novel she had discussed wanting to read, the kind of acquisition that required genuine effort to locate and purchase. Attached was a note written in handwriting that was precise and controlled, the penmanship of someone educated in formal environments. It read simply, "For you. Happy birthday." The intimacy of that gesture, the fact that he had been aware of the date, that he had invested time and resources into acquiring something specifically calibrated to her preferences, was almost unbearable in its implications. She held the book and felt something critical shift in her resistance to her circumstances, understanding that she had been lying to both of them about the nature of what was occurring between them. That evening she confronted him directly. She found him in his study, reviewing documents that she recognized as financial records, though the specific details remained beyond her clearance. She entered without waiting for an invitation and closed the door behind her, a gesture of intent that seemed to register immediately in his expression. "I need you to tell me the truth," she said. "Are you keeping me here because I'm genuinely necessary for your security, or are you keeping me here because you don't want me anywhere else?" Victor set aside his work and leaned back in his chair, regarding her with the kind of intensity that made her understand why his subordinates maintained careful distance. "The answer to both questions is yes," he said. "You are technically valuable as insurance against certain threats, but that is not why you're here. You're here because the alternative, which is your absence from this location, is something I find myself fundamentally unwilling to accept." "Then stop maintaining this pretense," she said. "Stop treating me like I'm incapable of making decisions about my own situation. Stop acting like there's something coercive about what I feel, when you know as well as I do that I'm choosing to feel it." Victor stood and walked to where she was standing in the doorway, and the proximity alone was enough to make her body register the tension between them as something almost physical. "If I allow what you're suggesting," he said, his voice lower than usual, "I become responsible for the consequences of that choice. I become the person who exploited your vulnerability. I become something I have very carefully avoided becoming in every situation of my life." "You're already responsible for my vulnerability," Madison replied. "You're responsible for my situation, my circumstances, my entire current existence. What you're afraid of is being responsible for the choice I'm making right now, which is to stop pretending that I haven't fallen in love with you, despite every rational instinct telling me that I should do precisely the opposite." The silence that followed that statement seemed to extend for days, rather than mere seconds. Victor's expression remained controlled, but there was in his eyes a conflict between desire and something that resembled genuine moral consideration. "If I do this," he finally said, "if I cross this particular line, I cannot uncross it. Everything changes. Your situation changes. The relationship between us changes. The security protocols that keep you protected from external threats must also protect you from internal consequences that I cannot guarantee will not occur." "I understand," Madison said. Victor closed the distance between them and kissed her with an intensity that suggested months of restraint, culminating in a single moment of capitulation. It was not gentle or romantic in any conventional sense. It was desperate and thorough, and held within it the weight of every interaction they had engaged in since the parking garage. She responded completely, her hands finding his shoulders, his chest, anywhere that contact was possible, and she understood that whatever happened after this moment, her life had bifurcated into before and after in a manner that could not be undone. They moved toward his bedroom, a space she had never entered previously, the inner sanctum of his private existence. The room was surprisingly austere, minimal furniture, no personal effects suggesting anything beyond professional functionality. The bed was large and positioned to offer visibility toward both the entrance and the windows, a positioning that reflected his constant awareness of threat, his inability to ever completely surrender to anything including sleep or intimacy. When they made love, there was in his movements a carefulness that seemed at odds with his general approach to existence, as though he was afraid of breaking something, of damaging her irreparably through the force of his own need. She pulled him closer, wanting him to understand that she was not fragile, that whatever strength she had been forced to develop during her recovery extended to this as well. By the time they finished, she understood that she had somehow crossed from psychological captivity into something far more complicated, a genuine entanglement that would be significantly more difficult to escape, if escape ever became possible. Afterward, Lying beside him in the darkness of his bedroom, she asked the question she had been avoiding for months. What happens to me? If your situation changes, if the threat that brought me here diminishes, what's the actual endgame for my existence? Victor did not answer immediately. His arm remained around her shoulders, and she could feel his heartbeat gradually returning to normal rhythm. I don't know, he finally said. This situation was never supposed to develop beyond temporary security. I never anticipated that you would remain here this long, or that what's occurring between us would become this complicated. In an ideal scenario, the threat diminishes. Your security is no longer dependent upon my proximity, and you're able to construct whatever life you want. But that scenario requires that I'm capable of letting you go, and I am increasingly uncertain whether I possess that capacity. So I'm supposed to just stay here indefinitely, Madison said. Accepting my captivity because you've decided that you're unable to release me? No, Victor said. You're supposed to continue exactly as you have been. We navigate the complications as they arise. When a choice becomes necessary, we make it together, armed with whatever information and options are available at that time. I cannot guarantee you a future beyond that, but I can guarantee that your safety and your agency are priorities that supersede my operational requirements. And that is as close to a promise as someone like me can actually make. She knew she should have rejected that answer as insufficient. She should have demanded concrete promises, specific timelines, guarantees about her future that Victor was in no position to provide. Instead, she let herself accept the ambiguity, understanding that she was falling deeper into a situation that was increasingly difficult to justify through any lens of rational self-interest. By morning, she would rationalize her acceptance as pragmatism. But lying beside him in the darkness, she understood that pragmatism had nothing to do with her decision to remain, that she had simply chosen to accept her captivity, because the alternative was separation from someone she had developed a complicated and genuine attachment to, despite her complete understanding of how problematic that attachment actually was. The dynamic between them shifted after that night, though the shift was subtle rather than dramatic. Victor treated her differently now, with a physicality that extended beyond what courtesy demanded. A hand would rest on her lower back when they moved through the penthouse together. His fingers would trace along her shoulder or collarbone when they were alone in his study. These gestures were small and controlled, nothing that could be categorized as careless or spontaneous, but they communicated something that words had not yet articulated between them. She was his in a manner that transcended the technical imprisonment of her circumstances. 3 weeks after that night, Victor appeared with news that seemed designed to shatter the fragile equilibrium they had constructed. He found her in the library, where she had been reading while rain hammered against the windows in sheets that created the impression of existing underwater. He did not sit down or adopt any of the casual positions that suggested a conversation of ordinary duration. Instead, he remained standing, and there was in his posture a tension that indicated something significant had altered. My organization has encountered complications, he said. Complications of the kind that will require my attention and resources for an indeterminate period. I wanted to inform you before external events dictated my course of action. Madison felt her stomach tighten immediately, understanding that complications in Victor's world translated to violence or threats, or operational threats, that required either strategic response or evasion. What kind of complications? She asked, setting aside her book. Federal agencies are initiating coordinated investigation, Victor explained. Investigation that was previously dispersed across multiple jurisdictions has become focused and systematic. Additionally, one of my regional associates has entered into discussion with federal prosecutors regarding potential cooperation in exchange for prosecutorial immunity. When that cooperation becomes public knowledge, which will occur within weeks rather than months, certain elements of my operational structure will become untenable. Madison stood and moved toward him, understanding that what he was describing was crisis rather than ordinary operational challenge. What does that mean for me? She asked. It means we have limited time to make decisions regarding your future, Victor said. I have considered 3 possible scenarios. In the first scenario, I relocate you to a secure location outside the continental United States. You would be protected under assumed identity with sufficient resources to construct an entirely new existence. You would be safe and free, but effectively isolated from everything you previously were. He paused, allowing her to process that information before continuing. In the second scenario, you enter into federal witness protection. You provide testimony regarding your abduction, your recovery, your residence with me. The federal government grants you protective status. Eventually, you might be permitted limited contact with your aunt. You rebuild a life with legal standing rather than assumed identity. But you are forever entangled with the system that previously tried to kill you, and you are available for potential retaliation by elements within my organization who might view your cooperation as betrayal. And the third scenario? Madison asked, though she could already anticipate the direction his thinking had proceeded. Third scenario is that you remain here, Victor said. We navigate whatever comes next together. But understand that this scenario is significantly more dangerous for both of us. My situation will likely deteriorate. Imprisonment is possible. Death is possible. You would be in proximity to that deterioration, vulnerable in ways that my protection cannot adequately mitigate. Madison understood that he was presenting her with choices that were, in their essence, all catastrophic. Freedom that required permanent exile. Freedom that required cooperating with institutions that were fundamentally hostile to her interests. Or remaining with him while his world collapsed. She felt the weight of that decision settling across her shoulders, like something physical and immovable. I need time, she said. You have approximately 48 hours, Victor replied. After that, external events will make the decision for us, and decisions that are imposed by external circumstances are rarely the ones we would have chosen for ourselves. He turned to leave, and she called after him. Where are you going? To meet with my legal representatives regarding mitigation strategies, Victor said. To inform my operational associates that restructuring is necessary. To prepare for scenarios that I would significantly prefer did not materialize. I will return this evening. After he departed, Madison found herself unable to engage with the book she had been reading, or with any of the activities that typically occupied her time. She walked through the penthouse, observing the space that had become her world for the past 7 months, and she tried to construct some framework through which to evaluate her options. Exile meant abandoning her aunt to permanent isolation. Witness protection meant betraying Victor in a manner that would result in his imprisonment. Remaining meant accepting potential death as a consequence of proximity to someone whose professional circumstances were rapidly deteriorating. She was sitting on the balcony overlooking the grounds when her aunt called. The contact was not through the monitored intermediaries that Victor had previously arranged. It was a direct call to a phone that Rosa had provided weeks earlier, a device that presumably had no security protocols or tracking capabilities. Hearing her aunt's voice after months of only written correspondence created an emotional response that Madison found difficult to regulate. Madison, her aunt said, and the relief in that single word was almost unbearable. The police came to my house. They asked questions about you, about Victor Castellano, about your disappearance. They told me that you were likely being held against your will, that they could help me, that they had been searching for you. Madison felt her entire body tense simultaneously. What did you tell them? She asked. I told them nothing, her aunt replied. They attempted to inform me that my concern for your well-being should translate into cooperation, but I recognized what they were doing. I hung up the phone and immediately called the number you had provided. Madison, what is happening? Are you being held? Are you in danger? I'm safe, Madison said, understanding that the statement was technically accurate, but fundamentally misleading. Aunt Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. If the police contact you again, you cannot tell them anything. You cannot confirm my location, my circumstances, or my relationship with Victor Castellano. To do so would place me in danger. Her aunt was silent for a long moment. Then she asked, Are you in love with him? The question caught Madison so completely off guard that she could not immediately formulate a response. She was sitting on a balcony overlooking manicured grounds that belonged to a man who was effectively her captor, and also the person she had developed genuine attachment to, and her aunt was asking whether she was in love with him, as though the answer was anything other than devastatingly obvious. Yes, Madison finally said. I am. And that is precisely why you cannot cooperate with federal authorities. Doing so would result in his imprisonment. And I cannot have that consequence on my conscience. Madison, listen to yourself, her aunt said. You're describing captivity and calling it love. You're describing coercion and calling it choice. This is not healthy. This is not. Madison ended the call. She turned off the phone and sat in the darkness for some indeterminate period, processing the reality that her aunt was correct, that she was describing circumstances in language that suggested Stockholm Syndrome or trauma bonding, or any number of psychological frameworks that would explain her behavior in clinical terms. Yet understanding those frameworks did not change what she felt, or how she was choosing to act based on those feelings. When Victor returned that evening, she was waiting in his study. He appeared tired in a manner that suggested stress had been pursued with considerable intensity during his absence. He began to speak, but she interrupted him before he could complete whatever statement he was preparing. I'm staying, she said. I'm choosing option 3. I'm remaining here and we navigate whatever comes next together. I understand the risks. I understand the likelihood that everything will collapse. I'm staying anyway because I cannot construct a life that does not include you in it. And I'm choosing to accept that reality, rather than continue pretending that I have any genuine alternative. Victor moved toward her and pulled her into an embrace that communicated something beyond language, a kind of surrender that seemed to release tension he had been maintaining since this entire situation had begun. They held each other while outside the penthouse, the city lights reflected off surfaces dampened by rain, and she understood that she had just made a decision that would define the trajectory of everything that followed. Over the following weeks, the situation around Victor deteriorated with remarkable speed. His regional associate did indeed cooperate with federal authorities, providing information that resulted in the indictment of multiple individuals within Victor's operational structure. His businesses came under intensified scrutiny. Federal agents appeared at properties he owned, executing search warrants and seizing documents and financial records. The threat level escalated daily from something that had been theoretical to something that was actively manifesting in their immediate circumstances. During this period, Victor began discussing operational details with Madison that he had previously kept compartmentalized. She learned the scale of his criminal enterprise, the sophistication of his financial strategies, the complexity of his network across multiple jurisdictions. She also learned that he was constructing a narrative that would protect her, that was carefully structuring what he would and would not admit when the inevitable occurred. He explained that if she testified, he would acknowledge certain specific crimes while denying involvement in activities that carried more severe penalties. He would construct a circumstance where she appeared to be a prisoner, rather than a willing participant in his enterprise. It was strategic and calculated, and represented, she understood, a form of genuine sacrifice. Her aunt contacted her again, this time through Rosa, who delivered a sealed envelope that contained a letter written in her aunt's distinctive handwriting. Madison sat in the penthouse and read words from the only family member she had left, words that expressed fear and concern, and a kind of resigned acceptance that Madison's adult daughter had constructed a life that was fundamentally incomprehensible to her generation. The final paragraph contained an instruction that Madison was to contact her aunt one final time through monitored channels, to say goodbye in a manner that allowed her aunt to experience closure rather than ongoing uncertainty. Madison made the call from a phone that Victor provided, knowing that it would be the last direct contact between them for an indeterminate period. She told her aunt that she loved her, that she was safe, that her aunt needed to accept that Madison had chosen a life that was different from what her aunt had anticipated. She told her that when the official narrative of Madison's situation became public knowledge, her aunt should believe what the authorities told her regarding capture and rescue and protection, because that narrative would be the only way that Madison could retain any kind of agency in how her circumstances were publicly understood. When the call ended, Victor destroyed the phone himself, removing the SIM card and burning it in a small dish in his study while she watched. He held her afterward while she processed the reality that she had just severed the final connection to her previous existence, that she had committed herself entirely to the future that was unfolding around them. By the time the federal indictment was officially unsealed 6 weeks later, Madison had accepted with remarkable completeness that everything in her world was about to change irreversibly. She had also accepted that she was choosing that change with full awareness of its consequences, and that her choice was not something that could be subsequently justified through psychological explanations or therapeutic frameworks. She had simply loved someone and decided that remaining with that person was worth whatever price the universe was about to extract from both of them. The rain came without warning, the kind of downpour that transformed the world beyond the penthouse windows into something aqueous and unreal, separated from normalcy by sheets of water that seemed almost deliberate in their intensity. Madison stood on the balcony overlooking the grounds, watching the manicured landscaping blur into impressionistic abstraction beneath the assault of weather. It was approximately 3 a.m, and she had not slept, had not attempted to sleep, had instead occupied the hours since Victor's departure by standing in darkness and processing information that she was not entirely certain how to categorize or respond to. He found her there without surprise, as though her location had been entirely predictable to him. He moved silently across the stone floor of the balcony and positioned himself beside her without speaking for what felt like an extended duration. The rain continued its assault on everything beyond their shelter, and there was in the sound a particular quality that suggested finality or transition rather than ordinary meteorological event. "You haven't decided," Victor said. It was not a question, but rather a statement of fact delivered with the kind of certainty that suggested he understood her thought processes well enough to know that decision-making would require extended contemplation rather than immediate resolution. "I've decided," Madison replied, though the words felt strange in her mouth, as though she was speaking someone else's decision rather than articulating her own. "I simply haven't informed you yet." Victor was silent for a long moment. The night air was cool, carrying the first real hints of approaching winter. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn sounded, a reminder that the world beyond these grounds continued to function regardless of what happened within this particular penthouse. He finally said, "I could make the choice for you. I could move you somewhere you'd be secure. Argentina, perhaps. Or somewhere in Eastern Europe where records don't connect to who you were before. You could live comfortably under assumed identity without fear of the complications my situation is generating." "You could," Madison agreed. "But you won't." "No," Victor said quietly. "I won't." They stood in silence for a while longer, and there was in that silence a kind of communication that transcended language, an understanding that passed between them without requiring words to articulate its content. She realized standing beside him that her decision had essentially been made weeks prior, that what she had been doing during these days of contemplation was not genuinely deliberating about her options, but rather accepting the reality of a choice she had already committed to on some level that existed beneath conscious awareness. "I want to testify," she said. "I want to enter federal witness protection. I want to tell authorities everything I know about my capture, my recovery, your involvement in my situation, but I want to do it in a way that protects you as much as is possible, given that I am cooperating with law enforcement." Victor did not respond immediately. His jaw tightened incrementally, the only visible indication that her statement had registered as emotionally significant rather than merely informational. "That would result in my imprisonment," he finally said. "Extended imprisonment. Decades, potentially." "Yes," Madison replied, "but it would result in my freedom. Genuine freedom. Not exile or assumed identity or a life spent looking over my shoulder wondering when my circumstances might change. It would allow me to maintain contact with my aunt. It would allow me to construct something that resembles an authentic existence, rather than perpetual dependence on your protection or your continued presence." "And what of what I feel for you?" Victor asked, his voice lower than she had ever heard it. "What of my preference to maintain your presence in my life?" Madison turned to face him directly, understanding that this was the moment where she would either commit to what needed to happen or retreat into the comfortable captivity that they had constructed together. "You love me," she said, "which means you can't keep me. Love requires that I be free to make genuine choices about my own existence. And I'm choosing to make a choice that removes me from your jurisdiction and places me in opposition to your interests. And I'm asking you to accept that choice, because it's the only way I can know that what I feel for you is genuine, rather than Stockholm Syndrome or trauma bonding, or any of the other frameworks people use to explain attachment under extraordinary circumstances. Victor reached out and touched her face, his hand gentle in a way that contrasted sharply with the controlled violence his body communicated in every other context. "If you testify against me," he said, "certain elements within my organization will view you as a threat that requires elimination. I have constructed safeguards against that response, but safeguards are not guarantees. You would be vulnerable in ways that federal protection cannot entirely mitigate." "I understand," Madison said. "You understand intellectually," Victor replied. "But you cannot understand emotionally, because you have not lived in a world where betrayal results in death. You are operating on faith that things will work out, and faith is a luxury that people in my situation cannot afford to maintain." Madison understood that he was right, that she was operating on optimism that was not entirely rational, that she was choosing to believe that federal protection would be adequate when there was no genuine guarantee that it would be. Yet she also understood that operating on fear would mean remaining imprisoned indefinitely, would mean allowing his captivity to extend its influence across every aspect of her future existence. "I need to speak with federal authorities," she said. "I need to establish contact and begin the process of providing cooperation. And I need you to not prevent me from doing that, even though you have the capacity to do so." Victor dropped his hand and turned away from her, facing the rain and the darkness beyond the balcony. "I will arrange it," he said. "I will provide the contact information for an attorney who works with the federal government. I will facilitate your initial communication with authorities. I will ensure that my organization does not interfere with your process of entering protection. And in doing all of that, I will be systematically dismantling everything I have constructed, including my freedom." "I know," Madison said. "Do you?" Victor asked, turning back to face her. "Because what I'm describing is not romantic sacrifice. It's not some grand gesture that ends with reconciliation or eventual reunion. It's me choosing to spend decades in federal prison because I love you, and I cannot be the person who denies you the freedom to make your own choices, even when those choices result in my destruction." Madison felt tears forming, though she was uncertain whether they were products of guilt or gratitude, or some combination of emotions that did not translate cleanly into any single category. "I would stay," she said. "If you asked me to stay, I would remain here indefinitely, rather than cause you this consequence. But you can't ask me to stay, and I can't ask you to let me go. So we both have to make this choice independently, with full awareness of what it costs us." Victor moved toward her and pulled her into an embrace that felt like goodbye, disguised as continuation, the kind of physical connection that carried within it the weight of every interaction they had engaged in since the parking garage. They held each other while the rain continued its assault on everything beyond the balcony, and neither of them spoke because language would have only diminished what was occurring between them in that moment. "Tomorrow," Victor said finally. "I will arrange everything tomorrow. I will contact the attorney. I will provide you with what you need to initiate federal cooperation. And I will prepare myself for whatever comes next." The following morning proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Victor provided her with contact information for a federal attorney whose practice specialized in witness protection arrangements. He sat with her while she made the initial call, listened while she explained her circumstances to a stranger who worked within systems designed to process situations exactly like the one she was describing. By midday, she had been transferred to federal marshals, who began the complicated process of extracting her from Victor's penthouse and initiating the protective protocols that would structure the remainder of her existence. The actual departure occurred in the evening. Madison moved through the penthouse one final time, observing the space that had become her world for the past 8 months. She ran her fingers along the spines of books in the library, touched the piano that Victor had never again played after that first night they were intimate, stood in the bedroom that had become the location of their most significant moments together. Victor waited for her in the entryway of the penthouse. Federal marshals remained at a discreet distance, giving them a final moment of privacy before the extraction process became official and irreversible. He did not touch her or speak to her. He simply stood beside her while she processed the reality that this was actually happening, that she was actually leaving, that their time together was transforming from ongoing reality into concluded experience. "I love you," she said, understanding that the words were inadequate to communicate the depth of what she felt, but that they were the only words available to her. "I know," Victor replied, "and that knowledge will be sufficient to sustain me during whatever follows. Go. Build whatever life you need to build. And know that I am choosing this outcome because I love you, and love requires that I allow you to leave." She turned and walked toward the federal marshals, not looking back because looking back would have undone her capacity to proceed. As she entered the elevator that would descend to the parking garage where a vehicle was waiting to transport her to a federal facility, she heard Victor say quietly, "Goodbye, Madison." The elevator doors closed between them, and she understood that part of her life had concluded in that moment, that whatever happened afterward would be shaped by the decision she had just made and the man she had chosen to leave behind. The apartment in Portland was small and functional, selected specifically for its ability to facilitate anonymity rather than comfort. Madison Chen no longer existed within any official capacity. Her new identity was Rebecca Walsh, a woman with a social security number that had been generated specifically for her, with employment history that had been fabricated backward through various corporate databases, with a background that would not withstand intense scrutiny, but that would survive casual investigation. The Federal Marshal's Service had established protocols regarding her existence, and those protocols included periodic check-ins, security measures that felt alternately protective and invasive, and a set of restrictions regarding her capacity to establish genuine connection with anyone outside her assigned protection team. She worked in cybersecurity for a consulting firm that never questioned her references or employment history, a position that translated her analytical skills into legitimate income. She rented the apartment on a month-to-month basis under her assumed name. She grocery shopped at specific times and locations that had been approved by her protection detail. She existed in a state of profound isolation that was, technically, freedom, though the freedom felt remarkably similar to the captivity she had recently escaped. The testifying had concluded 3 months prior. She had been transported to a federal courthouse in a vehicle that had been swept for surveillance devices. She had spent 6 hours on the stand providing testimony regarding her abduction in the parking garage, her recovery in Victor's penthouse, her residence with him, and the information she had obtained regarding his operational structure. The prosecutor had been meticulous in his questioning, carefully extracting information in a manner that established Victor's criminality, without pushing too forcefully into areas that might create liability for Madison herself, through implication of her willing participation in certain activities. Victor's defense attorney had conducted a brutal cross-examination that was designed to establish exactly what the prosecutor had been attempting to suggest: that Madison was not simply a victim, but a willing participant, that she had remained with Victor of her own volition, that her cooperation with federal authorities was motivated by self-preservation rather than genuine desire to serve justice. Madison had responded to every question with honesty, understanding that deception would only undermine her credibility and thereby reduce the protective value of her testimony for Victor himself, who had arranged his cooperation to result in specific reductions in sentencing severity. The conviction had been inevitable from the moment she took the stand. The evidence was overwhelming. The cooperation of various associates provided corroborating testimony regarding Victor's operational activities. His own confession, carefully calibrated to acknowledge certain crimes while maintaining ambiguity regarding others, had sealed the outcome. He had received a sentence of 15 years in federal prison, a reduction from what would have been a significantly longer sentence if he had not cooperated with authorities regarding operational details pertaining to rival criminal organizations. She had not seen him since the evening they separated in the penthouse. She had been informed through her protection detail that he was currently incarcerated in a federal facility in Virginia, that he had adapted to imprisonment with remarkable equanimity, that he had requested no contact with anyone from his previous life. She had been similarly informed that attempting to contact him was ill-advised, that such contact could compromise her protection protocols and potentially create legal complications for both of them. Yet 18 months after her entry into witness protection, she received a message that should not have been technically possible. It arrived through an encrypted server that she had established years prior, before any of this had occurred, and she recognized immediately that only one person possessed both the knowledge of its existence and the resources to access it. The message was brief. You are safe. That is all that matters. It was signed only with a V. She understood the implications immediately. Victor had found a way to communicate with her despite the protocols that should have rendered such communication impossible. He had employed someone still operating within criminal networks, someone with access to technological infrastructure that extended beyond federal surveillance capabilities. He was using these resources not to contact her in any way that would compromise her safety or protection, but simply to confirm that he remained aware of her continued existence, that she remained significant to him despite the distance and imprisonment and the systematic dismantling of everything that had existed between them. She did not respond to the message because responding would create traceable communication that could endanger both of them, but she saved it. She read it multiple times during the night after receiving it, understanding that Victor was communicating his continued attachment despite circumstances that rendered the attachment purely sentimental rather than practical. Over the following months, additional messages arrived at irregular intervals, always brief, always untraceable, always confirming simply that he remained alive, that he remained aware of her existence, that she had not been forgotten despite the intervening months and circumstances that should have facilitated forgetting. You are secure. Thinking of you. Alive. You matter. None of the messages attempted to ask her to reconsider her decision, or to resume contact, or to do anything beyond acknowledge that connection persisted, despite external efforts to sever it. Her aunt, through channels that federal marshals had facilitated, had been informed that Madison was alive and safe within protective custody. Initial contact had been limited and monitored, but 18 months into her protection, restrictions had loosened sufficiently to permit monthly telephone conversations of approximately 30 minutes duration. Her aunt's voice had aged significantly during the interim, or perhaps Madison's perception of her aunt had become more sensitive to mortality and fragility, now that she understood how completely absence could alter relationships. "Are you happy?" her aunt asked during one of these conversations. Madison considered the question carefully. "I'm building something," she replied. "I have work that's engaging. I have a stable living situation. I have the framework for an ordinary existence, which is something I couldn't have claimed during the previous chapter of my life. But are you happy?" her aunt repeated, suggesting that the answer Madison had provided was evasion rather than response. "I'm alive," Madison said finally. "I'm free. I'm able to make decisions about my own future, without external constraint. Whether those conditions translate into happiness is something I'm still attempting to determine." Her aunt was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "That man, Victor, the one they said was holding you, do you still have feelings for him?" Madison felt her chest tighten incrementally. "He loved me," she replied, "and he demonstrated that love by allowing me to leave. I will carry that with me for the remainder of my existence, regardless of whatever else happens." By year 2 of her protection, Madison had constructed something resembling an authentic life within her assumed identity. She had colleagues at work who she maintained cordial relationships with, though genuine friendship remained elusive, because genuine friendship would have required her to be fundamentally honest about who she was and where she had come from. She had a small circle of acquaintances, people she encountered at coffee shops or through recreational activities, people who knew her as Rebecca Walsh, and who would continue knowing her as Rebecca Walsh, regardless of what private knowledge she maintained regarding her own identity. She also maintained active surveillance of criminal justice proceedings related to Victor's case. She knew that his sentence was being appealed through various channels, that his legal team was constructing arguments regarding prosecutorial misconduct and sentencing disparity, that the process of adjudication would extend far beyond his actual release date if he maintained sufficient patience and legal resources to pursue every available avenue of appeal. She knew because she continued checking legal databases, accessing information that was technically available to the general public, but that her protection detail would have preferred she ignore. 3 years and 4 months after her entry into witness protection, she received a communication that was different from the previous messages. It arrived through the same encrypted server, but this time the message was considerably longer than a single sentence. It contained information, data, analysis of criminal operational patterns that only made sense to someone with her analytical training and her knowledge of how criminal organizations actually functioned. As she decoded the message, She realized that Victor was providing her with information regarding organized crime networks that her knowledge would recognize as originating from specific geographic locations and operational structures. He was providing her with intelligence that could be valuable to federal authorities if she chose to provide it. She understood what he was communicating. He was using his incarceration and his connections to intelligence networks that persisted despite his imprisonment to continue operating in the shadows, to continue dismantling criminal enterprises that engaged in activities he had always refused to participate in. Human trafficking, drug operations targeting vulnerable populations, the kind of systematic victimization that operated beneath the surface of legitimate business structures. He was continuing to do what he had always done, which was to impose a code on chaos. But now he was doing it from within a federal prison cell, using resources that no one had anticipated he would maintain access to. The information was too valuable to ignore. She contacted her protection detail and provided them with the decoded message, explaining that she had received communication from Victor and that the information he had provided contained operational details regarding organizations that law enforcement would presumably find significant. There was immediate escalation through her protection detail to federal authorities who recognized the significance of what Victor was providing. Within weeks, Madison was being debriefed by federal agents who wanted to understand the mechanism of how she had received the communication and how reliable the information contained within it actually was. She explained about the encrypted server and Victor's apparent access to technological infrastructure that extended beyond federal prison protocols. She explained that the information was consistent with what she understood regarding his analytical capabilities and his knowledge of criminal organization structures. She did not explain that the information also represented an ongoing form of connection between them, a manner in which he was demonstrating that what he felt for her remained significant enough to motivate continued action, despite the obstacles that incarceration had created. 2 months after providing the federal government with Victor's initial intelligence package, Madison received another message. This one was shorter than the previous. I hope what I provided was useful. I hope it allows you to understand that my feelings remain unchanged despite the distance. I hope you know that this is the only way I can demonstrate that love now, through actions rather than presence. She did not respond, but she saved this message with the same care she had afforded the previous ones. She understood that Victor was engaging in a form of long-distance relationship that was conducted entirely through unilateral communication and demonstrated through intelligence that he was providing to federal authorities. He was not attempting to rebuild what they had shared. He was simply attempting to maintain awareness of her existence and to demonstrate that existence remained significant to him. By the end of year 4, the pattern had become established routine. Messages would arrive at irregular intervals. Sometimes they contained intelligence. Sometimes they simply contained confirmation that he remained alive and aware of her continued existence. She would receive them and process them and maintain careful records of them. She would occasionally pass intelligence information along to her protection detail when it seemed sufficiently significant to warrant federal attention. She would otherwise maintain silence and distance and the boundaries that their respective circumstances required. Her aunt remained elderly and fragile, and the monthly telephone conversations became increasingly precious as mortality began asserting its inevitable presence. Madison recorded these conversations in her mind, understanding that they represented the final years of the only biological family she had left. She considered informing her aunt that Victor had not forgotten her, that connection persisted despite the intervening distance and time and her own entry into witness protection. She decided against such disclosure because her aunt had always maintained that what Madison felt for Victor was trauma response rather than genuine emotion, and revisiting that debate would serve no purpose beyond creating conflict. She was sitting in her apartment on a rainy evening, the kind of weather that seemed to activate memory in a manner that clear skies could not achieve, when she received a message that was different from all the previous ones. It was longer. It was more personal. It contained not intelligence information, but rather narrative, explanation of how Victor spent his days within the federal prison, what he read, what he thought about, how the years of incarceration had transformed his understanding of his own existence. It contained reflection regarding his choices, acknowledgement that the life he had lived before incarceration had been defined by elements that he would have preferred to change. It contained genuine vulnerability in a manner that all previous messages had carefully avoided. The final paragraph contained a question. Do you ever regret the choice you made to leave me? Or do you recognize that it was the correct decision, despite the pain it has caused both of us? This time, she responded. Not immediately, but after 3 days of contemplation. She did not respond through the encrypted server, because responding through that channel would have created ongoing communication that both of them had deliberately avoided. Instead, she contacted her protection detail and explained that she wanted to send a letter to Victor through federal prison mail, a letter that would be monitored and screened and would not create risk to either of them because it would be documented within official channels. Her protection detail was skeptical, but agreed to facilitate the communication. Madison spent an entire evening writing and rewriting a letter that she knew would be read by multiple people before it ever reached Victor. She wrote about her life in protection, about the work she had found, about the strange existence she was maintaining under assumed identity. She wrote about her aunt and the fragility of remaining family connections. She wrote about understanding, finally, that what had occurred between them was not something that could be categorized as trauma bonding or Stockholm Syndrome or any of the other clinical frameworks that people attempted to apply to their connection. She wrote that she did not regret her decision to leave, because that decision had been necessary to establish whether what she felt was genuine or circumstantial. She wrote that the years of separation had answered that question definitively. She wrote that she loved him still, and that love persisted not because of proximity or ongoing contact, but because of the depth of what had existed between them and the sacrifice he had made to allow her to construct a life that was genuinely hers. She concluded by writing, I don't know if we will ever see each other again. I don't know if the circumstances of our lives will ever align in a manner that permits reunion. What I know is that you loved me enough to let me go, and that is a form of love that I will carry with me for the remainder of my existence. Thank you for allowing me to be free, even when that freedom resulted in your imprisonment. It was the greatest gift you could have given me. The letter was mailed through official channels and was presumably delivered to Victor within the federal prison system. Madison received no response because responding would have risked reopening communication that both of them had committed to maintaining at a distance. But she understood that the message had been received and understood, and that understanding was sufficient to complete something that had been unfinished since the moment she walked into the federal marshal's vehicle and accepted that they were separating permanently. Years continued to pass. Her aunt eventually passed away, and Madison mourned in isolation within her assumed identity, unable to attend the funeral because doing so would compromise her protection protocols. She remained in her job, continued to maintain her anonymous existence, and occasionally received messages from Victor that were briefer and more infrequent than they had been during the earlier years of her protection. She understood that he was aging, that the years of incarceration were accumulating consequences, that eventually the messages would cease entirely when whatever remained of his operational network finally deteriorated entirely, or when he himself reached the end of his natural span. She did not attempt to contact him again after that single letter. She understood that communication had served its purpose, that it had provided closure and confirmation, and the knowledge that what they had experienced together remained significant despite the years and distance and the systematic dismantling of any possibility of reunion. She understood that love sometimes manifested as acceptance of permanent separation, as recognition that another person's freedom and well-being transcended one's own desire for continuation or reconciliation. She was standing at a window of her apartment, looking out at Portland rain that never seemed to permanently cease, when she reflected that the woman she had been when she first met Victor in that parking garage no longer existed. She had been reconstructed through trauma and recovery and testimony, and the years of building an anonymous existence that bore no resemblance to the previous iteration of herself. She was not certain whether that reconstruction was positive or negative, but she was certain that it was permanent, and that she had chosen it with full awareness of what it would cost her. Somewhere in a federal prison, there was a man who had loved her enough to dismantle his own freedom to establish hers. That knowledge remained sufficient to sustain her through whatever isolation her remaining years would contain.